Quick note before this week's show, I just finished recording this episode when I listened to the most recent episode of Poetry Says called An Absolutely Ordinary Poem. And I think probably not surprisingly because Alice is a friend and because it was actually in conversation with her that I developed some of the ideas that went into this episode. There's a kind of a funny, they're not on the same topic and they're not saying the same things, but they do seem to be in a funny kind of tacit dialogue with each other. She even uses, or she cites somebody else's use of the phrase "the big picture" with a sort of a similar angle of criticism to the one I take in this episode. So it's great as Poetry Says always is, and very much worth listening to before, after, or if you're Cameron, you can get a transcript, I guess, during, while listening to this one. So go check out Poetry Says, An Absolutely Ordinary Poem. And now here's this fucking mess of a show. So I found a poem the other day. Like typically the term found poem is used for language that a poet stumbles upon in some non-poetry text and then excerpts and maybe breaks it into lines and calls it a poem, a la the Duchamp fountain that was really a urinal turned upside down, this sort of thing. So I'm I've never been like a big fan of the found poem category, but I found what I would not normally indulge in that sort of thing in the finding of poems, but I saw a poster or a flyer stapled to a there are a lot of not always interesting but opinionated and sometimes surprising flyers posted in my small town. So there was a flyer stapled to a telephone pole in downtown Carborough. I walked by and I saw it looked like an erasure poem. And I mean, it effectively was an erasure poem. Like, I don't know, other than like redacted documents, which are not really, which are really meant to be like a version of the document with the naughty parts cut out. I don't know of any other use of this method in the creation, like for the creation of literature that's not the erasure poem, right? And for those who don't remember, an erasure poem, this is a technique that is very much in fashion at the moment, that involves basically the blotting out of the great majority of a text, leaving only a handful of carefully selected words, which, when read in order, produce a secondary text, often one that is in some sense at odds with the primary text, though not always, as we have touched on in recent episodes. So this was a found erasure poem. It was definitely a political poem, and I knew that right away because it was a found erasure of a politician's letter. So this is a U.S. senator, one of the senators from North Carolina, and I as I've said before, I'm not great at keeping up with politics, and when it's a small town, we have an election truly every year. And so I sort of try to bone up on whatever the question or the candidate of the day is, like the morning I go to vote. And then I mostly forget about it outside of that brief span of hours. So I recognized the name of the senator. What I couldn't remember is whether he was a Democrat or Republican. And it didn't say anything about that on the letter itself, or at least not in the part that had not been blotted out. So the non-blotted out part, this was a letter from, dear, presumably this is a constituent letter or a donor letter, but it was signed from, signed by the senator, and other than the following words, the whole thing had been blacked out, except insofar as you could see that it was a letter, or a sort of a form letter with a stamped signature at the bottom. So the leftover text, the erasured text, the text that was not erased, read, "We, the people of North Carolina, support indiscriminate funding for Gaza and peace." And then it was signed the senator. And I read it and I knew that this was an opinionated erasure, and I knew that it was in some way critical of or at odds with the senator. But what I actually couldn't figure out was in what direction. My thought was like, regardless of who it is, like chances are probably simply because of the use of erasure, these are lefties who are making the criticism. But lefties criticize Democrats as well as Republicans frequently, and so I wasn't sure. Like, a version of a criticism I could read if I didn't know that erasures were mostly employed by lefties, then like I could very easily see this being like a conservative criticism of either a Democrat or like what a conservative might call a rhino, if Republican in name only, basically saying like, oh, the secret message in this senator's rhetoric is that he is in support of Hamas. Of course, also obviously another interpretation was that this was a criticism of a senator who was not sufficiently in support of Gaza or Palestine, and that the letter was saying, oh, what he should actually be saying is we support indiscriminate funding for Gaza and peace, we the people. So I think what it became pretty clear just by my knowledge of the form that this had to be a lefty speaking, and probably it was, whether he was a Democrat or a Republican, the argument was he's not supporting Gaza enough, and he ought to be. The reason I had some uncertainty was that there were two words included in the final found erasure poem that seemed to be sort of at odds with each other. One was peace, and one was indiscriminate. So what I mean, I guess, is that I assumed that somebody who was criticizing the senator for, like, I assumed somebody who did not want funding of Gaza would not include peace in a bundle with Gaza, right? Because like that, you would think that if you don't want to support Gaza, then you wouldn't link those two things. So presumably, like, if those two things are appearing as the kind of the object, the desired object of support or of funding, then presumably this is a critic in favor of funding for Gaza. But then the other word that threw me was indiscriminate, because it was calling for indiscriminate funding of Gaza, and to me that sounded like a fiscal Republican criticism. Like, oh, these Democrats or these lefties, they would just want to throw endless money at the problem. Indiscriminate money, the indiscriminate meaning careless. I think what I finally figured out was that because peace was sort of had more weight finally than indiscriminate, I thought it had to be somebody who was supporting Gaza. And the best explanation I could think of for the inclusion of indiscriminate was that this was somebody who had read indiscriminate as meaning non-discriminatory. Like, the idea was that discriminate funding would be discriminatory funding, and we wanted the opposite of that. So I think that's kind of what I concluded. But so what you can gather here is that, apart from my ignorance of or failure to remember the party of the senator, turns out he was a Republican. I think I've already forgotten again. I'm pretty sure Ted Budd. Republican. Yeah. So he's a Republican. These are lefties making the criticism, as I had imagined. But what it reminded me of was this funny moment. I think I'm pretty sure I have mentioned it at some point during the podcast that I had at my sister's wedding when I read, as everyone does at every wedding, Sonnet 116, and I made a mumbled introduction to it. Because I think that there'd been a lot of stuff going on. Nobody at any ceremony thinks like, oh, I hope this next reader has a really long text to read from. And so I stood up and I said, I'm going to read Shakespeare's 116th sonnet, so it's very short. And what I meant, of course, was that it's a sonnet, and so it's short, and I was identifying it as 116. I probably should have just said sonnet 116, maybe that would have been clearer. But before I read it, the priest said he was getting tired, and then a bunch of people laughed. And I was really confused. Like, it didn't understand what had happened. And it took me a second, and then I realized that, he had understood me to be saying that this was the 116th entry in this series of poems, and because it was the 116th entry, they'd gotten shorter because he was tired and he didn't have the stamina to write a long poem at that point. Of course, I knew that all sonnets are the same length. I mean, if you read Shakespeare sonnets, that's not technically true. There are some weirdly one or two there's short ones, but sonnet, the sonnet defines a length of poem, and so in order to get the joke, I would have needed to know less than I knew. And I think similarly with the Ted Budd erasure poem, in order to understand the intended meaning, or at least to understand it cleanly and immediately, I needed to know less than I knew. I needed not to understand the meaning of indiscriminate, or at least the connotation of indiscriminate. And so what this sort of led me to think about, among other things, was this parable that has been nagging me for a while now. So this is it's a very famous parable, very celebrated, much quoted, most recently and extensively quoted in the or at least to my memory, in the epigraph for Nathan Hill's first novel, The Nix. He quotes like a very long version of it. So there are many different versions of it. It is depending on the version, either of Hindu or Buddhist origins, but presumably this, that means it comes originally from India, and it is known commonly as the parable of the blind men and the elephant. And it has long annoyed me, but I haven't until recently, I think, figured out exactly why. So this is the version Wikipedia presents. It's a pretty concise version that will get across the idea that is consistent across all of the versions I've encountered so far. The one addition that the Nathan Hill epigraph had was that at the end, the person who is hearing the story is being told to a king, and at the end, the king laughs and laughs and laughs, which was sort of a nice touch. But I still found it annoying. Here is the Wikipedia version, and then I'll tell you maybe my thought about it. A group of blind men heard that a strange animal called an elephant had been brought to the town, but none of them were aware of its shape and form. Out of curiosity, they said, "We must inspect and know it by touch, of which we are capable." So, the elephant's brought to town. These four blind, or group of blind men, encounter it, and they can't see it, so they have to touch it in order to figure out what it is that they're encountering. So they sought it out, and when they found it, groped about it. The first person whose hand landed on the trunk said, "This being is like a thick snake." For another one, whose hand reached its ear, it seemed like a kind of fan. As for another person, whose hand was upon its leg, said, "The elephant is a pillar like a tree trunk." The blind man who placed his hand upon its side said the elephant is a wall. Another, who felt its tail, described it as a rope. The last felt its tusk, stating the elephant is that which is hard, smooth, and like a spear. And so the idea, of course, is that if you asked any of these blind men later what it was that they'd encountered, each one would describe something different from the others, and yet none of them would be exactly wrong. I first encountered this parable as a sort of an analogy for the different religions approaching God, and that it's not, each one seems to be describing something that could not possibly coincide with the definitions that are offered by the others, or in some cases seems, at least only partially to coincide. But in reality, if you really had the full view, you would see that they all fit together. They all are part of a unified whole. So I've long found this parable annoying, and I will confess that is partly, though not wholly, due to the use of it in the title of Gus Van Sant's inexplicably celebrated movie Elephant. I mean, he won the fucking Palme d'Or for Gus Van Sant's made some good movies. This was a terrible movie. And I mean, among other things, it presented the argument that the Columbine kids did what they did because they were secretly gay, which just seems like such a bizarre, Gus Van Sant's gay. I'm not going to call it a homophobic argument because I think that's simplistic, but what? What is that even gesturing at? I mean, not only does it show no understanding of what was going on with those two kids, but it doesn't seem to even offer a worthwhile additional perspective on anything. I found that movie unbelievably annoying, but everybody loved it. It won lots of prizes, and the title, the parable doesn't appear in the movie anywhere except there's a blanket with a picture of an elephant on it, and presumably it is inspired by the title, the parable, because we see little snippets of a bunch of different people's days, all of which are non-overlapping or only barely intersecting in the moment of the shooting. So yes, I confess that is probably part of the reason I find this parable to be annoying, but that's not the only reason. And it came to me recently as I was thinking about this whole Ted Budd thing and this problem of knowing, you need to know enough, because if you hadn't known anything about erasure poems or about politics, or if you would say hadn't heard about the violence in Israel and Gaza, then you wouldn't understand it either. So you needed to know the right amount. You needed to know enough, but you couldn't know too much, because then if you knew too much, it would become illegible again, or at least harder to interpret. So you needed to have a big enough picture, but not too big a picture. And this is, I think, what finally landed for me with the parable of the blind men and the elephant. And it's simply this, that in the parable, because of course we, whatever our sensory capabilities, whatever our experience, of course, there is truth to this parable. Of course, each of us encounters a reality that doesn't perfectly overlap with or coincide with everybody else's, and each of us has these perceptions that are not, false or distorted necessarily, but are limited to our own perspective. And, we can't accept through an attempt at empathy and imagination, we can't really unify all of our different conflicting perspectives. But that doesn't mean that one of us is right and one of us is wrong in all cases. So of course there's truth to it. Of course. And as parables go, it's not a terrible one. But what I finally realized really bugs me about it is that it's called The Blind Men and the Elephant. That is, in the parable, the only people who don't know what it is are the blind men. And so instead of being a parable about how all of our knowledge is limited, it seems to be a parable about how some people's knowledge is limited. And in a way, it suggests a sort of paternalistic approach to education or knowledge. That we need to make sure that those ignorant people don't fail to get the big picture. Because the people who know that it's an elephant have the big picture. In the big picture, the blind men are all wrong or only partially right. And it's really an elephant. And it made me want to call the parable something like the blind men and Yog Sothoth. Some like physically inconceivable Lovecraftian monster shape that we do encounter in little snippets here and there, but that none of us can ever conceive of in its whole being. And I know, yes, of course, we are all the blind men in the parable, and I know that I guess like the only person leading the people leading the elephant to the blind men is like God or God's angels or something. But it just seems to me like part of what's so annoying about the blind man and the elephant parable is that we all get to participate in nodding sagely and understanding the whole picture. Whereas just think of how much weirder a story it would have been if it were just a story about 4 blind men encountering an animal in the wild, and we never learn more than they do. Like it wouldn't have the mousetrap snappiness of the current version, but it would be so much more unsettling. In the same way that Lovecraft stories are unsettling. Like, as has been much discussed and correctly discussed, Lovecraft was a horrible racist. But the part of what makes his stories really compelling, and in fact makes his better stories better and his worse stories worse, right? And I think some of his weaker stories, like The Outsider. The Outsider is a very famous story, but it's one in which the main character, emerges from this bizarre, sort of hellish, otherworldly place, and he climbs up into the world, and he walks into this big crowded room, and he's so excited to finally see other people, and as he walks into the room, all of the people in the room are terrified of a monster, and he doesn't understand, and he sees the monster on the other side of the room, and he's so angry that the monster is scaring away all the people that he runs toward it, and it's this hideous, unspeakable fiend. And of course, as you have surely already guessed, when he reaches to seize the monster, it's a mirror, and he is the monster. And like part of what makes that story to me, like cool, I get it, but like it's so anticlimactic, it's so dopey, is that it feels very finished. You get the whole picture. You get to know everything. Whereas in, I think, many of the better stories, this isn't, of course, the only thing that makes them good, but like in many of the better stories, you get a glimpse of it in passing. It's sort of like how Moses gets to see God's backside as he's going away, right? And that's about all we mostly get to see of the Elder Gods. In the Call of Cthulhu, you do see Cthulhu in the water, sort of rammed head on and cut in half by this boat. And to me, like that's a little bit of a weak moment in the story, because you get a little too much of a sense of, all right, here it is. It's big and scary and gross. Whereas a story like the Dunwich Horror, you get bits and pieces of it. You see the cattle who have been shriveled up by this thing. You see these weird tracks in the mud. You see this person who is the bastard child of a human woman and the monster, and he is giant and very hairy, and when they find him dead, his whole torso is covered with suckers, like on the underside of an octopus. And Lovecraft's racism aside, like what is so unnerving here is that we don't even have close to the big picture. All we know just enough to know that we have not nearly enough knowledge. Like all we know is that we don't have the big picture. And I think like that's the value of the Blind Man and the Elephant story is the looking for the big picture. The problem with it is the believing you have found it. And okay, so there are like several sort of versions of this problem that have been on my mind lately. So one is this really, I think, fascinating conversation I had with Alice and Elijah a while ago when I sent them this story called Picture-ism by Yukio Mishima. Yukio Mishima is a Japanese novelist and short story writer who he was very successful. He was very handsome and very physically impressive and very masculine. He also his politics skewed conservative, Famously, he was also gay and very much closeted / in denial about that. And he died after a failure to he wanted to reinstate an older Japanese order. His last words were "Long live the emperor," and then he committed seppuku, which, if you presumably know what this is, but it's a ritual form of suicide that has existed in Japan for centuries, and it involves the cutting open of one's own stomach, after which, once you have cut far enough through your stomach, across the side of your belly, you stick it in the side of your belly and you pull it across. And this is cutting open the stomach, not just the entrails, right? I mean, any of which would be horrifically painful, but the stomach is even more painful because it's full of hydrochloric acid. So cutting open the stomach, and then if you succeed in actually cutting it open far enough, then the tradition is that you have a second who stands behind you with a katana and cleanly cuts off your head to honor your willingness to commit this act of, again, see my rant on suicide, but like insanely courageous, if also totally horrifying act. So he committed seppuku, only his second was very bad at his job and did a very bad job, and it took a while to kill him. He was also a brilliant writer, and one of his sort of more notorious short stories is called Picture-ism. So I sent it to Alice and Elijah because I really liked it, and I brought it to one of my fiction classes, and boy, did they not really like it. They hated it, or at least the ones who read it thought it was either too boring to finish or very misogynistic. I was honestly surprised by this response, and I sent it to Elijah and Alice, and their responses were much more perceptive than my students, and also I think probably more perceptive than mine, because Alice said it doesn't seem really sexist exactly, because so this is a story in which a young man who's a soldier is his friends are involved in an act of military treason, and he is called upon to join in the effort to put down this rebellion. So effectively, he is in the military. He's received an order to go help kill his friends that he loves and has sworn to fight alongside. So he's faced with an insurmountable contradiction. And Japanese culture provides an out for this circumstance. If you can't follow your orders and you can't commit treason, right? If you went to join his friends, he'd be committing treason. If he followed his orders, he would be betraying his friends. If you can't do either of these things, if you were confronted with either an insurmountable failure or an unbearable dilemma, then it is sort of legally and morally acceptable and even honorable to commit ritual suicide. So he tells his wife he's going to do it. This young man, he's newlywed. He and his wife have only been married a brief time. They're very, very in love. They're very beautiful and picturesque and ideal in many ways. He tells his wife he's going to do it. Once he's made the decision, there's a great kind of tranquility that settles over them. They have this really wonderful sort of perfect last night together, and they make love and they eat food and they do all these, things that enjoying each other's company because they are so deeply in love. Everything is very ceremonial. Everything is very beautiful and very carefully and perfectly put together. And she is horrified, but also totally fulfills her role of supporting him. And if you're already thinking, well, this sounds sexist as all get out, maybe so. I think there might have been some truth to that. But let me get a little further. when he actually sticks the knife in, he feels a wave of like molten metal pouring through his body, which is presumably the acid from his stomach. And he is stunned and horrified. And he has this thought that passes through his mind, which is because the whole thing's taking place in the past tense. The thought is, was this seppuku? Like, wait, this is this thing I've heard so much about. I may have even witnessed an act of this. I know that it is honored. I know it's part of this tradition. I know it's held up as an option under the worst circumstances. And those who commit seppuku are understood as having done the right thing in some sense. And when he actually starts to do it, he's crippled by horror. He can't believe that it's this thing, this horrifying pain, and this deep sense of wrongness. It reminds me a little bit of this moment in the Magic Mountain when this guy is getting his lungs examined, and he has to be awake for this procedure, which I don't know if this is even a procedure we would do today. This is the beginning of the 20th century. But he's awake for this procedure where he's anesthetized, but he's still conscious, and he can feel this doctor put his hands inside his chest and touch his lungs. And he says it's not pain, but it's this deep feeling of physical wrongness, that he's like almost nauseated and dizzied by this sense of like somebody's hand is inside my chest touching my lung, and he can't. It's more horrifying than he can bear, and it's totally like, if it were merely raw pain, it would be easier than this weird experience he goes through. And this is something like what the main character in Picture-ism goes through, except it's also accompanied by unimaginable pain. He does, however, follow through the seppuku. His wife assists him in her role as his second. She doesn't have the strength or training to cut off his head, but she does cut his throat very quickly. And then the story ends with her doing what is, I think, a non-compulsory but acceptable act for a widow of seppuku, which is that she, immediately after his death, she slits her own throat. And that's the end. Now, Alice read this as a story that was sort of beautiful and well done, but very jingoistic. That was basically celebrating, that was sort of, earnestly called patriotism, as like this is the right thing. Look at this beautifully executed, perfect example of what one must do as an honorable Japanese man under circumstances like these. And Elijah thought it was that, but he also thought it was sort of misogynistic, and I think he made a smart note about this, which was in addition to celebrating the aspects of patriotism that involve men committing suicide and honor above all, Mishima also seems to be approving of the totally patriarchal culture in which women are definitely not treated as equals. And so in that sense, it's sexist, if not misogynistic. I think both Alice and Elijah are very smart and insightful there. What was funny to me was that it's not that I didn't see those things. It's that I guess I saw them in a slightly different frame. That is like, I can't quite figure out if I'm zooming in or zooming out when I think this. But what I read it as was a depiction of what patriotism looks like in this society. And as with, the Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, this is a great moment of patriotism. This is patriotism at its best, at its most picturesque. An act of seppuku under the most sensorily pleasing conditions, when everybody involved is beautiful and clear-headed and honorable and strong and strong of will and loyal, and everybody does the right thing. And in a way, like, all of the idealization of the characters and of the circumstances I read almost as an indictment of patriotism. Again, I tend not to read things in moralizing terms, but I saw this as Mishima saying, all right, here is what it looks like. Because I don't think it's possible to read the story and not be overwhelmed with horror. It's so disturbing. It's so upsetting. I could not imagine leaving that story and thinking, tough but fair. Like I couldn't imagine coming away thinking like, well, it's ultimately to the good that this is how this society works. To me, I saw a story in which the main characters had effectively no choice, or what choice they might have had, they no longer believed they had. And they were trapped by circumstance. It's sort of like, Greek heroes in some of the tragedies. That's always the tension in Greek tragedies between free will and fate. But this to me read a lot like, a tragedy in which, and Elijah talks about tragedy some in his note. He says, I've never seen the elements of tragedy, the impossible dilemma, the noble sacrifice carried out so explicitly in a short story before. There's O'Connor, but her tragic sense is ironic and therefore impure. It makes one imagine the formal possibilities. The story, however, is too tinged with jingoism and blatant idealization to have a truly tragic effect. I think I'm with him in that I think that it is really the tension between free will and fate that makes Greek tragedy so powerful. That where neither one totally wins out. We never feel totally confident saying, well, Oedipus had no choice. Nor do we feel totally confident saying like, well, this was all Oedipus's fault, right? It's sort of, we can't separate them from each other. Whereas I think in patriotism, it does seem to be, if not fate, then the constraints of the society they live in. And I saw it as a story about two beautiful young people being destroyed by a medieval sense of honor. I know actually medievalist Marianne Corbett, if she hears this, would probably shake her fist and say, medieval is not a pejorative term, which I know. It's people use medieval to mean something that is not actually true to the Middle Ages. But yeah, like it made me think about the story anew. I have not tried to teach it since, and I don't know that I would, at least not. At least, I don't know, man. Because I don't know. I mean, I also like. I don't know the right way to think about it. Like, I think this is partly what comes up in my use of magical quotation marks, right? I think like part of the reason I always want to put magical quotation marks on a poem, a short story is a little different, particularly when it's not told in the first person, as this one is not. But part of the reason I think I always want to put the quotation marks on the poem is to say, this is somebody's idea of the big picture. Rather than, well, this is the author telling us that this is the big picture. So before I go on, because this all came to mind in a slightly different form recently that I only recently kind of realized was getting at the same problem. But before I do that, I should say that this is that I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and this is a podcast called SLEERICKETS that has conventionally been about poetry and other intractable problems. This episode being maybe a little bit of poetry and a lot of intractable problem. Thank you for listening, and thank you for subscribing to The Secret Show. If you do, The Secret Show is an additional podcast feed that accompanies this one. You get a lot of part twos of good conversations on here, along with a lot of original solo content and other stuff. Conversation I just put up tonight, in which Brian and I discuss our brilliant job as fathers that and all of the ways in which we do not regret our decisions in raising our children. People who listen to The Secret Show seem to like it. It's pretty sticky. So if you have not checked it out, go to sleerickets.substack.com and put in your email address, and I'll give you a week's access for free, and you can see what you think. And it's pretty cheap. You get a new episode every week. Lately, that's what I've been doing. I'm going to try to keep that up. So it's a new episode every week, which is more consistent than the main feed, since I do occasionally take a month off here and there. I think it's worth trying out, and it helps pay for things like the new microphone cord I just bought that, with any luck, is making your sound a little more balanced as you listen to this. So please do go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com and check out The Secret Show if you haven't already. And if you have, then thanks so much. I appreciate it. Also, if you're not willing or able to pay for a little bit of extra material, then do take a moment at some point in the next week, say, to mention this show to somebody you like, or at least someone you think it would be interesting to have a conversation with. I'm not on Twitter. I don't teach at a university. I'm not in a social scene apart from like hanging out with Jonathan, who's great, but it's sort of a social scene of two. So I don't really know, there's not really any other way people find out about the podcast. And so I do really appreciate, if you can't do anything else, then please just tell somebody about SLEERICKETS who might like it. I'm grateful. A couple other quick pieces of business. Oh, yeah. I have notes here. I made notes. Oh yeah, I did replace the mic cable. I can't totally tell looking at the feed on GarageBand as I'm recording this. I can't totally tell if it's balanced or not. I think it should be more balanced than it had been, but it's a much nicer cord and it seems to be working better than the old one did. So I'm hoping this fixes the sound problems, and your left ear and right ear are both hearing roughly the same amount of stuff. Oh, final question, and this is sort of open-ended, but I have talked, and plenty of other people have talked on this podcast, a lot about poetry classes, workshops, lectures, experiences, good, bad, funny, or otherwise. If you are somebody who would ever be interested in taking a poetry class at this point in your life, wherever that is, some of you are in MFA programs, or you're taking poetry classes elsewhere. You're studying with Shane McRae or Joshua Megan or Maury Creech and a number of other people. And welcome to all of you, and you all have excellent teachers. But if it's the sort of thing you might be interested in, or you are interested in, I would love to hear simply what kind of poetry class you find valuable. Do you like, or would you like a lecture, a workshop, a class drilling, form, an open discussion, a kind of one-on-one feedback? Like, what kind of poetry class, if you were to take a poetry class, would actually be worthwhile for you? I just would love to hear any of your thoughts about that, what that looks like or sounds like to you, or what your good experiences have been. I know there are a lot of ways to have bad poetry classes, and I've had plenty myself, but I would love to hear what you think a good one might look like, or has looked like in your experience. So give that a thought, and just send me an email at sleerickets@gmail.com and let me know what you think. It is not for nothing. It's thoughts brewing, maybe more to come, but we'll get to that later. So the other thing that had been on my mind that I think I thought of in the same loose vicinity, I thought of it in the same loose vicinity as this blind man and the elephant problem, this big picture problem, but I just sort of wasn't quite sure how it all worked. So this thing happened during an episode I recorded with Allison Brian. I recorded it a little while ago and just released it recently. I think it came out under the title, The Mercy Rule. So part 1 was on the main feed, part 2 is on the Secret Show feed. I think they're both quite good, and I can't remember, I think it was on part 2 that Brian and I clashed with Alice over this funny question, and in listening back to the conversation later, I was really sort of puzzled by my own response. What she brought up was the prospect of learning that somebody else was feeling the same thing you're feeling. If you're feeling bad in some way, if you're feeling like a failure, or you're feeling like you're not enough of a man, or you're feeling like your work is not good enough, or you're uncertain, or you've wasted your life, or so, whatever it is. As I just read off the transcript of my inner monologue at the moment, how does it make you feel to know that others feel the same way? And Brian and I think, were pretty emphatic. I was most emphatic, but Brian and I both said, like, no, that doesn't help at all. I take no comfort from that. And in fact, I sometimes take irritation from that. And I gave the example of the Stephen Marsh case of, Philip Roth felt like a failure as a writer. And, that's fucking unbearable to hear. I don't fucking care what he felt like as a writer. He was wildly successful by any measure. So shut the fuck up, Philip Roth. And listening back to it later, I thought, well, what gives? Like, I know I don't like hearing people who are much more successful than me complain about not being successful enough. I know that's annoying to me. But like, why wouldn't it be the case that I would take some solace in knowing that other people felt what I felt? And in fact, like, isn't that some of what lyric poetry has done for me in the past? When I've read really good lyric poems and thought, like, oh, he felt what I felt. When Keats in When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high piloted books and charactery hold like rich garners the full ripened grain, when I perceive upon the night starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and think that I shall never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance, and when I feel, maybe it's feel, I don't know, and when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. Then on the rim of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. In addition to furnishing, I think, the title of John Berryman's worst book, I don't know, second to worst book, Love and Fame, that poem struck a nerve with me, still strikes a nerve with me, because it rings true. Like, I feel that. And hearing Keats articulate that feeling so poignantly is in some way consoling to me. So, like, what the fuck was I talking about with Brian and Alice? But I think this is where I was reminded of a bit of contemporary slang that I first encountered. So we're probably familiar with the term white people problems. I first encountered the term white people problems in Louis C.K.'s 2010 comedy special Hilarious, which is arguably the whitest place you could possibly have first encountered a term that undoubtedly was coined somewhere by a speaker of black vernacular English. Like, it just seems so obviously to be something that was not coined by Louis C.K. On a comedy stage, but he had a whole routine that I remember at the time finding pretty entertaining about white people problems. I will do what every stand-up comic dreams of and read it to you from the text I have in front of me. He says, "We have white people problems in America. That's what we have. White people problems. You know what that is? That's where your life is amazing. You just make shit up to be upset about. People in other countries have real problems, like, oh shit, they're cutting off all our heads today. Things like that. Here, we make up shit to be upset about. Like, how come I have to choose a language on the ATM machine? It's bullshit. I shouldn't have to do that. I'm American." Now, he had many versions of that routine, but that was the first time I encountered the term white people problems. I think in retrospect, it's pretty clear that among other things, what he's actually talking about is something we have another term for today, which is first world problems, because it's not only white people problems who complain. It's not only white people who complain about ATMs or complain about cell phones. Was another one of his. He had a lot of bits about how we complain about having cell phones, which we shouldn't do. That's clearly not something that white people have any kind of monopoly on. What he seems really to be talking about is first world problems, which is a term that was oddly enough invented. So the term first world originated. This was actually a case of my dad telling me something as a kid, giving me like a Just So story, a Calvin's dad explanation of vernacular English that turned out just to be completely right. He was just totally right. We use the term third world today to mean a country that is not a developed industrialized democracy. Basically, that's basically how we use third world. Democracy, maybe is the wobbly term in that definition. But here, I'm going to plug this in just so we can get a sense of the. Not German, French. Why is it translating from German to German? What was I looking at before? It's useless. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so this was an essay published in 1952 by Alfred Sauvy called Three Worlds, One Planet, published in French. I don't speak French, so I will try not to speak French to you. But he talks about basically the thing my dad explained, which was that the third world really referred to the countries that were neither the United States nor the Soviet Union, or maybe more broadly, like in the orbit of the United States, or the orbit of the Soviet Union. These were sort of the two major powers, and then there was the sort of the leftovers, the countries that were not included in either those nations or those spheres of nations. The countries that were closely allied with the United States or the Soviet Union. The third world was everybody else, and he's really not talking about. It's a pretty smart essay. I read it a couple weeks ago in Google Translate, so I won't. I won't try to summarize it for you, but it's an interesting essay. But it really develops this term, the third world, more than it presents first world. And we now think of first world in a slightly more, both a broader and a more limited sense. Anyway, I'll include a link to that French essay, which you should feel free to read. But then the term first world problems used in that sense, what you can find is a lot of essays saying such and such is the first world's problem. The same way you can find a lot of essays saying such and such is white people's problem. But the first instance I could find anywhere of the term first world problems or first world problem, this is a first world problem, was in a publication of the Rural Advancement Foundation International on the use of African indigenous knowledge to address global health and environmental problems. So I think there was basically a plant that some African indigenous people had used for their own purposes that turned out to be maybe valuable in Western medical applications as well. The first use of the term white people problems I could find was in 1989 in a speech by Terence McKenna, who's an environmental activist, called The Ecology of Souls. And that's, he says, the environment is not a white people problem. And that seemed to be like getting to kind of the way we use it today. As I said, I feel confident that the term existed before this, but these were at least just oh my God, that's so creepy. I just realized this little like headshot of Terence McKenna. It's tiny. It's like the size of a dime. And I just realized it's moving. Like he's slowly looking around my room. That's hard. Why would you do that? The Library of Consciousness? What the fuck is wrong with you? I gotta turn this off. So, yeah, heebie-jeebies. So, but then I found what I thought was like a better demonstration of the way we have come to use the term white people problems or the term first world problems, because, Louis C.K. is weirdly kind of conflating the two, but I think we now use both, though we do use them in slightly different contexts. First world problems, maybe we use them sometimes interchangeably the way Louis C.K. did, but I think first world problems is understood to sort of encompass a lot of white people problems, at least when we're talking about American white people. But there was this article in the New York Times on the wellness, or the well section. I guess well is a section. Health. It's not called health, it's called well. It's by Tara Parker Pope. The title is Are Marathons Safe? This was published in 2009. And here was it's a whole piece about how people die during marathons sometimes, but also that marathons are maybe, can cause health problems and lead to earlier deaths, or can, basically like running is good for you up to a point, but then it starts to be bad for you is kind of the idea. And there are arguments about this, and I don't think it's a settled question. But Tara Parker published this piece about it in the New York Times. And then I love this comment so much. There's a comment section where you have to be a subscriber to comment. And several down the row of comments, there's a short comment by Greg. It just says, this is so good. Published the same day as the article came out. He wrote, "Marathon deaths are white people problems. Aren't there other health topics which would benefit a wider audience?" It's so good. It's such a marathon deaths are white people problems. Oh God. It's like the idea that complaining about these marathon deaths, what a white people thing to do. I mean, setting aside for a moment the fact that, like, if you look up the winners of like all 6 of the major world marathons, if you look up the winners of all 6 of them, like the top 10 for the past 20 years have been like almost entirely Kenyans and Ugandans. Like, I mean, not totally, but like wildly Kenyans are overwhelming everybody else, and then Ugandans come in with a strong second place. And I think one of those people over the last 20 years was a white American, because plenty of the others who were Americans were also like were from Kenya or Uganda. So it's just like the idea that marathons are only a white people problem. Maybe marathon deaths. Maybe that's fair. Like maybe people who run marathons and die running them, maybe those are mostly white people. I don't know. But either way, I just think like the total like humorlessness and hard-heartedness and like arbitrariness of this like decision to comment on a health essay by saying marathon deaths are white people problems, like that to me exemplifies our use of this term today. In Tara Parker Pope's defense, she responded by saying, there are 8 other posts so far on the blog this week on a variety of topics. Like, we write about other stuff too. Shut the fuck up, Greg. But I thought like Greg's comment was exactly the way I think I have heard the term white people problems used very frequently over the past, say, 10 years, since 13 years since I first heard it. And I think like a couple things are true at once, right? Like, yeah, so first world, if you look up on the Google, this is the thing I was trying to find in the Google Ngram viewer, which is an interesting tool Google offers where you can look through. It only works for Google Books. That is like the texts that Google has had scanned and entered into their digital library. But there is a tool that will show you the relative occurrence of any given word or term, phrase, with some limitations in the body of texts that it has over the course of the last 200 years, roughly. So you can see like which words got used more or less. Again, I've speculated about, I should actually do a Google Ngram viewer for platforming. Let's see how that comes out. My guess is it's not a recent enough only goes up to 2019. Well, let's see what how platforming shows up on here. Platformed, platforming. So platform, yeah, okay, so platform, it's always been a relatively common word. Its use increased significantly up to a peak in 1910, and then it trailed off, and then since the late 80s it's been on a steady upward curve. Let's cut platform because it's blowing the other two out of the water so we can't even see the results. Platforming, oh interesting, platforming peaked in 1953, but then it did a U, so it's dipped and now it's shooting way back up again. So I wonder how people are using platforming in 1953. That's interesting. Platformed had a less clean but similar kind of rise and fall and rise. Both are on the rise now. Platforming is like firing upward now. But so I looked on the Google Ngram viewer for first world problem, third world. So the first, I was thrown a little bit because the Alfred Sauvy essay is published in 1952, but there is a peak, not a first use, but a peak in the use of first world in 1948. And I thought, from 1948, like it's shooting upward from 1936 to 1948. The term first world is just firing upward. And then it occurred to me that this is surely appearing in the phrase First World War. Because even though that was the era of the Second World War, or the era leading up to and then spanning the Second World War, before then they had no need for the term First World War because it was simply the Great War. And so it was as the possibility of a Second World War became more and more real, the term First World War came into usage, which is kind of cool to see charted out. And you see Second World peaks in 1952, which is the year of this essay. It's on the rise before then, but that's sort of it was very much of the zeitgeist, and then trails off. And then Third World is way below the other two, but it peaks also in 1950, and then dips way down, and then shoots back up again, building up to a peak in the mid 80s, which is, of course, as the Soviet Union was reaching its crest and nearing its collapse. And then all of these terms are on the decline now. Though I would be interested to see, so first world, white people problem did not turn up. Yeah, so first world has dropped way off in use, but first world problem, which was basically non-existent for a very long time, appeared and began really spiking in like 2007 or so. And it's just a straight line upward since then, basically. I would guess that white people problems would be similar, that it probably did appear earlier and would have a few more little bumps earlier in its usage, but it would then be way on the rise. Now, so why do I care about all this? What does this have to do with the big? I gotta shut this off. This Terence McKenna. Ugh, it's so gross. This little picture of him with his bulging eyes smiling out at me. Ugh. So the other thing hiding in the Louis C.K. bit, apart from his like weirdly equating white people with the first world and telling people to stop complaining, he's also weirdly in that particular bit, he's bagging on conservatives. He's bagging on people who at the time were making a fuss about pressing 1 for English, not liking the idea that there was a lot of Spanish in public use in America, which feels like a problem very much of another era. Like I don't even really hear anybody. I don't even hear like people make fun of people for saying that really anymore, because I don't think people are worried about that one way or the other. But it's weirdly like it's sort of a. It's funnily like a slam on conservative white first worlders. But I think like the grain of truth and maybe wisdom in that routine and in other uses of that term is the pointing out of a possible bigger picture, right? like what's valuable about a term like white people problems or first world problems is that it points to a greater context in which what seems right now to be all-consuming as a question could actually be thought of in slightly different terms. That maybe in the bigger picture, it matters a little bit less than we thought it did. And there are other problems we should be thinking about. And sometimes we should be thinking about them more than the problems that consume our days, which might be first world problems, say. So I think that's what's really valuable about a term like that, an insight like that, is that it reminds us that our current perspective is not the big picture. I think the big problem with a term like that is that it can, the use of it, the Greg-like use of it to mock marathon deaths can be, it's easy to fall into into the same trap, actually, the trap of thinking that you have seen the big picture. And this is where I think, like, I realized that whereas 20 years ago, I think I would certainly have heard somebody else, an expression that somebody else was feeling the same way as me. I would almost certainly have heard that taken that as a kind of a solace, right? Because it should be solace, right? It should be consoling to learn that other people are in the same boat. Right, and as we discussed, there is a slight difference between the consolation of hearing someone else is feeling the same thing as you, and the consolation of hearing that someone else is having the same actual problems as you. But I think 20 years ago, I probably would have seen less distance between those two. Right, I would have thought less about whether or not someone was right to be upset about the thing that was upsetting him. Whether or not I was right to be upset about the thing that's upsetting me. I think the problem with terms like white people problems and first world problems is that we start to take, among other things, we start to take other people's suffering not as a sign of our common humanity, not as a sign that, like, well, we do share things. We are, in some sense, in this together, but rather as a reminder that many of us don't have the right to be upset, right? Because there are two different ways, or many ways, but there are two obvious, very different ways that you can interpret news that someone else is suffering, right? If you are suffering and someone else says, oh, well, Jim is also suffering, right? That can mean a couple of things, right? That can mean you're not alone. If someone else is suffering the way you're suffering, then maybe you are not alone. And that is consolation. But if someone else is suffering, if you're suffering and I say Jim is suffering, the other meaning that can have is, shut the fuck up. What do you have to complain about? Jim's problems are bigger than your problems. And so your problems don't count. And that's where I think, like, these kinds of arguments, that because other people are suffering, your suffering doesn't matter. I think, like, this is, again, the same problem of the big picture. Like, on the one hand, it is good to look for the bigger picture. That's deeply valuable. Like, I think there's basically intrinsic good in believing that, in looking for the bigger picture, or at least there's some advantage there. There's some value there. Almost always that will lead you to a wiser perspective, a more humane perspective. But I think there's a great deal of danger in believing that you have found the big picture. And especially in believing that you have found the big picture. You see the big picture. You know it's an elephant. But those people over there, they have the small picture. They don't see what I see. I think that is super dangerous. Yeah, I guess I want to come out not in favor of small pictureism, but against big pictureism, and maybe just in favor of, well, because I don't know, like, big picture, maybe that's not true. I think, like, there's value in looking for the bigger picture, but maybe not always. Like, this is the thing I was talking to my friend Brendan about the other night, that, like, I I have found that I don't really read about mass shootings anymore. Like I just don't, Joanna will tell me about them sometimes, or, and clearly there was one, not a mass shooting, but a scary public shooting in my town recently. And obviously I was very aware of that, but I think that looking bigger and bigger and bigger maybe doesn't always lead to a more humane perspective. Maybe it does up to a point, but there are so many people in the world that there are always going to be an unimaginably large number of people suffering in unspeakable ways at every single moment of your life. And, if some tiny fraction of those people you can help, that's wonderful. Caring for your fellow human beings obviously is deeply important. But I'm not convinced actually that always keeping the biggest picture in mind, that always wanting to have, maybe it's partly wanting that your picture to be the biggest picture. Maybe that's part of the problem. And sometimes that can mean looking for the bigger picture. Sometimes that can mean thinking you have found the bigger picture, but wanting the bigger picture as a good in itself, maybe that's actually a danger. Because here's what maybe seems to have more intrinsic value than merely looking for the bigger picture, is knowing you don't have it. That whatever your problems, whatever your suffering, whatever your world or color or sensory capabilities or whatever, knowing that your picture is not the biggest picture. Maybe that's where wisdom lies, rather than in either believing that you have achieved the bigger picture, the biggest picture, or just in seeking it out ever and ever and ever beyond amen, right? Because at some point, what I have begun to hear recently is arguments about the importance of people suffering in the global south. And I don't dispute those arguments. It's totally an important thing to think about, particularly in the context of climate change. But the flip side of that term of concern, the global south, is the suggestion that, in fact, if you are listening to this, unless you're part of my beloved audience in Australia, then there's a very good chance that your problems are North Hemisphere problems. And for that reason, they can be, to some extent, downgraded in importance or in urgency. And after that, even it's a show Joanna and I are watching, good old Britt Marling, God, I love her. She's just bananas. She's just, you can always count on her to be super bizarre and bonkers and interesting. And then just, I think I didn't really understand the term galaxy brained until I saw some of her movies. But we're watching a thing of hers, and there's a character in it who's an astronaut and who's basically, once she went to the moon, she became obsessed with the preciousness of life on Earth. And that's wonderful. Life on Earth is wonderful. But you already begin to hear the possibility of these are really Earth problems. Out there are plenty of planets that don't even have life. So clean your plate. Yeah, I just think that maybe there's maybe the wisdom is in just knowing that you don't have the biggest picture, that there is a bigger picture, and there will always be an even bigger one. But sometimes we just have to deal with the picture we've got, which is not my argument for not caring about things outside your own house, but maybe it's my argument for giving the people inside your own house a little bit of a break from time to time. Greg. All right. I figured I'd close with this poem, which is sort of on topic, but I don't really want to read a poem that's just sort of demonstrating a lesson. It's just a poem I really, really like. And it does sort of deal with an individual experience that then gets framed inside of a slightly larger context. And then maybe we learn that context is not in itself quite enough. This is called Sea Grapes by Derek Walcott. Sea grapes are a form of seaweed or a sea plant. They look like grapes. They're these little green spheres, and they look a lot like grapes. They apparently are edible if you can eat them if prepared in a certain way, but they taste like salt water, basically. They don't taste like delicious earth grapes. He is looking out at the sea and imagining the Odyssey and the characters there. That sail which leans on light, tired of islands, a schooner beating up the Caribbean for home, could be Odysseus, homebound on the Aegean. So he sees this boat, tired of islands, right? Maybe tired of these literal islands, or tired of the islands in the old story. And as he sees it, he thinks, I could almost be Odysseus sailing home. That sail which leans on light, tired of islands, a schooner beating up the Caribbean for home, could be Odysseus, homebound on the Aegean. That father and husband's longing, under gnarled sour grapes, is like the adulterer hearing Nausicaa's name in every gull's outcry. This brings nobody peace. The ancient war between obsession and responsibility will never finish, and has been the same for the sea wanderer or the one on shore, now wriggling on his sandals to walk home, since Troy sighed its last flame, and the blind giant's boulder heaved the trough from whose groundswell the great hexameters come to the conclusions of exhausted surf. The classics can console, but not enough. Damn it, I just realized that I stole the end of another poem from this poem. Oh well, it happens all the time. I was reading, I was rereading, it was The Optimist, and I realized, like, I stole one line from one of his poems, the Joshua Megan's first book, and then I stole another line from his epigraph. Oh well. So yeah, like the story of Odysseus, obviously, among his many other adventures, including his first big error, which is an error of pride and of failing to, in some sense, failing to see the big picture, is after blinding Polyphemus, the son of Poseidon, the great Cyclops, who wanted to cook and eat him and all of his men. After blinding him, after outsmarting him, blinding him, Odysseus had been clever enough to call him, when asked what his name was, he called himself No Man. And so no one, some Greek version, no one or no man. And so when all of the other Cyclopes came and asked Polyphemus who had blinded him, Polyphemus screamed in fury, no man did this to me. And Odysseus laughed and laughed and laughed. And then he called back from when he was sailing away, he called out and he said, if anyone asks you, tell him Odysseus did this to you. He couldn't resist. And of course, this is a terrible mistake because Polyphemus prays to his father, Poseidon, who is, of course, the god of the sea, which is exactly where Odysseus is. But on his trip home, he famously sleeps with a lot of different women. He goes to a lot of different islands. He has a lot of different lives. I mean, he really like lives out, it's almost like that, it's one of the things that old, The Inner Light, the beloved Star Trek episode where Jean-Luc Picard lives a whole life inside the life of this man on this alien planet, and then he dies, and when he dies he wakes up and he's back in his starship, and only a couple minutes have passed. And we were watching that, and there's a lot to be said about that episode, but part of what it reminded me of was Odysseus, that he'll just go live with Calypso. He lives with Calypso for 20 years or something. Not 20 years. He lives with her for many years. He has basically a whole life there, and then he sort of up and leaves. Which is what my daughter inadvertently pointed out as the nice parallel to Dido and Aeneas, proving that Virgil had no original thoughts. But yeah, I just think this is a really elegant, touching, but also very sort of naturally spoken poem. Nausicaa is she appears in the middle or early middle of the Odyssey, but she is a young beauty from, I believe, the last island he visits. And he has this sort of famous encounter with her where he's naked when he comes out of the sea, and she's embarrassed and he's embarrassed, and she gives him clothes, and then she brings him to her mother and father, and they put him up and take care of him. And there's this sort of tension, and there's this sense that oh, well, he's slept with fucking everybody. Clearly he's going to sleep with her. And it just sort of never happens. and she ends up marrying his son. But I like the, maybe knowing a little more into what we know about some of Derek Walcott's own personal behavior. It's a little less charming in context, but it's not Calypso's name that Odysseus hears in every gull's outcry. It's not the name of any of the other many women he slept with. It's Nausicaa's name, the one that got away. So whether he's making excuses to himself or to his wife, I like the use of the under the gnarled sour grapes, right? Which is the sea grapes of the title are there, but also the grapes of Aesop's fable. I didn't want that anyway. Only maybe I did. And then the ancient war between obsession and responsibility will never finish and has been the same for the sea wanderer or the one on shore now wriggling on his sandals to walk home since Troy sighed its last flame. So he's found a greater context for his individual, whether personal or imagined struggles. He's found the greater context in the story of Odysseus and of all the classical figures who lived out this sort of set of problems. But in finding that larger context, he's also found that there's no real solution. This is an old problem that's been going on, and it's going to keep going on. It will never finish. Yeah, it's such a strange, but then intuitively convincing suggestion that it's not just the waves of the ocean, but specifically the waves thrown up by the boulder that Polyphemus throws after Odysseus, that of course misses him. But it's the big wave and the waves that follow that boulder that inspire that's where the great hexameters come from. The hexameters being the lines of Odysseus, the lines of Homer's verse, the Iliad and the Odyssey. From whose groundswell the great hexameters come. Not quite hexameter, almost hexameter, not quite hexameter. That line. It is. Yeah, it's also just a really nice use of that that kind of vers-libre form where the lines are of irregular length, but they're still basically iambic, and then they all rhyme. Most of them pretty true rhyme. Caribbean, Aegean, name, same, flame. They all rhyme, but they don't rhyme in any regular way. I think the only line that doesn't have a rhyme, even a slant one, is the first one, which is that sail which leans on light. And nothing is a match for light. All right, I'll read Sea Grapes one more time and then I'll sign off. This is Sea Grapes by Derek Walcott. That sail which leans on light, tired of islands, a schooner beating up the Caribbean for home, could be it. Maybe that. I mean, that is. I don't want to fucking teach a lesson with this poem, but it is to some extent a poem in which he sees larger possibilities in a small incident, and then he concludes with a recognition that he can only see so much, he can only know so much, and his wisdom only goes so far. There is more to know, but he's not going to know it. Sea Grapes. That sail which leans on light, tired of islands, a schooner beating up the Caribbean for home, could be Odysseus, homebound on the Aegean. That father and husband's longing, under gnarled sour grapes, is like the adulterer hearing Nausicaa's name in every gull's outcry. This brings nobody peace. The ancient war between obsession and responsibility will never finish, and has been the same for the sea wanderer or the one on shore, now wriggling on his sandals to walk home, since Troy sighed its last flame, and the blind giant's boulder heaved the trough from whose groundswell the great hexameters come, to the conclusions of exhausted surf. The classics can console, but not enough. Yeah, and I think if I were to give an Elijah Blumoffian note on that line, from whose groundswell the great hexameters come, which is, as I noted, 11 syllables long, It's pentameter, but it's 11 syllables. So it's not hexameter. Hexameter is 6 feet. This is 5 feet. Dactylic hexameter is those are much longer lines than even iambic hexameter would have been. But it's not just that that's not hexameter. That's the longest line in the poem, and it's just shy of hexameter. And I think a lesser poet, for example, me, would be very hard to resist making that a line of hexameter. Though Walcott insisted that he did not scan and he did not even understand scansion or care about it, if one were to make an argument about the significance of the scansion here, it would be an acknowledgement that even at its grandest, his poetry falls short of Homer's. Though I have heard Omeros is great, I have not read it, which is one of Walcott's epics that he wrote in partial tribute to Homer. The classics can console, but not enough. All right. Thank you for listening. You can reach me, as always. Do let me know about if you have thoughts on what would be a good poetry class, what that might look like to you, or what that has looked like to you. Let me know. And you can write me at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.